Right. Welcome, everybody. As you're joining in, welcome to today's presentation on gardening with wildlife in mind by the Canadian Wildlife Federation. You're all joining in. As people are joining in, I thought it's kind of fun if you'd like in the chat to say hi, where you're from. Remember to choose everyone rather than just host and panelist. Otherwise, only I will see it and no one else will. But it'd be fun to see where you're from. And if you want to share anything about your garden plans, your garden experience, any wildlife you've seen this week. So please feel free to share. I am Sarah Colber. I am with the Canadian Wildlife Federation's Gardening for Wildlife program, and I'm just west of Ottawa, and it's actually a beautiful sunny day today right now. Anyway, that's where I'm at. Where else are we going to go? Housekeeping. Oh, yes, this is being recorded, so you will get an email afterwards with the replay link. So don't feel you have to take a bazillion notes or you're going to miss out on something if you're late or if you have to leave early. The Q&A is the area where it'd be great if you could put all your questions there. So at the end of the webinar, if any of you do have questions, then at least I just go to the one spot and then I find it there. Hello, Margaret from Lethbridge and Monica from Calgary, Lisa from Kelowna. That's great. It's always fun seeing where people are coming from. London, awesome. Thunder Bay, Windsor. You know, Canada is such a big country. It's always fun to see, we usually get people like from coast to coast, at least. Niagara Falls, Deborah and Simcoe. Oh my gosh. And the chat does go by kind of fast sometimes, but I like to save the chat so I can read it after and see all your comments and thoughts, and it can help me sometimes provide material and content that's helpful in the future. But so I will see it even if I can't read it right now. Oakville, Kingston. Oh, cool. Cork. That's not too far from me then. Nova Scotia. There we go. We're getting farther now. New Brunswick. Wonderful. Okay, so as you guys are sharing still, let's see what else I need to share with you. So yes, if anyone's just joining in still and missed my first few words, we're sharing where we are in the chat. You can say to everyone, then we all get to see versus just host and panelists. This will be recorded. You'll get an email at some point. Oh, it's a bit muffled. Okay, well, sometimes you can turn it up on your end, but if it's being muffled, maybe I'll just bring this closer. I usually am told that the sound is quite clear when I have this set up. So hopefully this is okay for you now. Wild columbine about to bloom. Oh yes, ours are. I've got some blooming and some about to bloom too, and they're beautiful. And they usually sort of bloom around the time when the hummingbirds start to come back too. East of the ruby-throated ones in the east. Gimli, Manitoba. Hello, Lacey. Oh my gosh, I love it. Thank you. Okay, so I think I've gone through enough housekeeping. It's going to be recorded. Please put your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to get started. I'll just say again, my name is Sarah Colber. I'm with the Canadian Wildlife Federation's Gardening for Wildlife program. And the Canadian Wildlife Federation, we're a national not-for-profit organization that's been around for over 60 years. And yeah, we're really pleased to bring this today. And I'm so glad that so many of you are here joining us. Collicum Beach, Comox Valley, awesome. Okay, so I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and that I acknowledge the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous people. And, oh, I'm sorry, Nuri's having some sound issues. Yes, hopefully everyone else can hear me clearly enough. I'm going to actually keep moving along because I want to make sure we stay on time. So today's presentation, a little bit about the Canadian Wildlife Federation. What is wildlife-friendly gardening? Why bother doing it? How to do it? And a look at some of our garden visitors and residents that we want to support. Our garden habitat certification and different resources that we have that could support you. So as I said, we've been around for over 60 years, and our mission is to conserve and aspire the conservation of Canada's wildlife and habitats for the use and enjoyment of all. We do this in three major ways: with education, with youth of all ages, and adults of all ages, with programs like this, for instance. We conduct research, we do our own sort of conservation initiatives as well. You can see from the pictures, we've got kids in schools doing some planting. We've got our turtle team out, they do surveys. They also work with with turtle eggs that are at risk, of at-risk species, and then release them again in a similar spot, but safely away from the roads to help populations at different conferences, working with policymakers. We've got our whale team in one of the pictures. They work with fishermen and also politicians and whatnot to create and find gear that's more beneficial to minimize and prevent whale entanglement, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of cool stuff going on. Our roadside pollinator team on in the other photograph. So those are the different ways we help conserve Canada's wildlife. So what is wildlife-friendly gardening, which is my particular angle? And I see it as considering the needs of wildlife when making changes to your space or simply maintaining your space. Every choice you make has an impact. And so we're doing it with ourselves in mind, as well as our wild neighbors. So why bother doing it? There are so many reasons. Now, the wild plants and animals are our neighbors. They're part of this planet. They're part of the web of life, but they're also very important to our well-being, and they're facing challenges, lots of them, and need our help. So some of the threats that they're facing are loss of habitat and degradation of habitat. So even though some habitat is still there, it's being spoiled with pollution or being fragmented, mainly due to development is a big part of that. Of course, having barren lawns is a big problem because it's lacking plant diversity. It's just a monoculture of lawn. There's nothing much there to support anyone. That lacking the native plants that the wildlife need, lack of a continuous food supply, shelter, etc. Introduction and spread of invasive species, sometimes through the horticultural trade, sometimes by accident. There's a picture of goutweed there. That's a big one. That's a problem that's spreading. I've heard that they're kind of taking over part of Toronto's ravines. And I've seen them in our area too, being a problem. Polluted food sources due to pesticides is a big one. And also pesticides, of course, killing, directly impacting wildlife as well as indirectly through their food. Whether it's the growers that we're getting our food and our plants from, or whether it's ourselves and how we manage our space. So how does wildlife-friendly gardening help counter all of that? Well, the good news is our gardening activities, we make so many choices and we can positively affect both the world near and far, supporting the nature we need and love, all with very simple choices. And together, all our gardens are creating corridors and connections with each other and with larger natural areas, giving wildlife a chance to thrive in these changing times. So I don't know if you know Doug Tallamy. If you haven't checked him out, I highly recommend it. He's an American author, researcher, a university professor. His books are great. And he's taking lots of important concepts and translating them into very manageable, understandable chunks for everybody. And he really believes, as do I, that gardeners and our garden spaces are a key part of the conservation movement, if you will, that's going on and making a really big difference in tipping those scales. And this quote I love: "Gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. It is now within the power of individual gardeners to do something that we all dream of doing, to make a difference." And we can, and we are. So here we go. Benefits of wildlife-friendly gardening. Well, it supports our emotional and physical health. Our spaces become safer because we're not using pesticides. We feel good knowing we can positively affect the world near and far. We're creating visual interest, places to explore and discover. And of course, the wildlife that we're experiencing are exciting to discover and relaxing to listen to, like the birds, and delightful to watch. So when we're helping them and they're helping us pollinate our plants, whether it's at home, our economy heavily relies on pollination. I think it's billions of dollars annually. They help our natural spaces to thrive. There's also pest control. So thanks to all kinds of creatures, from birds and dragonflies and salamanders and bats, they're helping keep certain potential pest species in check. And small animals also break down dead plants and animals to return nutrients to the soil for our growing plants. So wildlife help us, we help them. It's a wonderful relationship. But how to do it? So I like to summarize it in these points. Food, water, and shelter, which we all need, are the habitat elements to include. And there's all kinds of ways we can do that, and we'll go through them today. And then the fourth one is, well, once you've got this habitat and you're attracting them, well, it needs to be a safe environment. So you need to avoid the pesticides that can harm them or their food. And then consider other earth-friendly practices like composting, etc., which we'll go through. So the first one is the biggest section, food. There's a whole lot of ways, as you can see in the list, that we can help with food. So we'll start off with flowers, and this is also a big one. I like to take my time with this because people are really excited and interested in pollinators. And there's a lot of stuff we can discover and know about how to help them that perhaps we might not have known before. So nectar and pollen are for pollinators. You can see here Joe Pyeweed on the left. The middle is willow. Willow, there are so many species native to Canada. They're not all ginormous. Some of them can manage with, average soil, moderate soil. And they're one of the first things to bloom. And we don't really notice them much because they're not overly showy perhaps to our eyes, but they're very important to awakening bees. There's goldenrod in the top, right? And people often think, although I think that misconception is changing now, that goldenrod causes hay fever, but it's actually ragweed, which blooms at the same time and is inconspicuous, but that is what has the lighter pollen that travels on the air and irritates people. Goldenrod has heavier pollen and is not able to do that. And the lupin on the bottom right. And I'm not going to go through all the plants. I'll do some of them, but it might make things too long. So if ever any of you have questions about plants, we can talk about that after. But I'm going to talk about our 7 kinds of pollinators. Bats are pollinators, but not in Canada. Our bat species do not eat, go to the flowers and eat the fruit and whatnot. They are all insect eaters. So our pollinators are bees and flies. And according to one fly expert I know, he really feels flies are perhaps Canada's top pollinator because of our climate. But I think bees and flies, they're pretty close. So I'm not quite sure which one truly is the most efficient pollinator. Wasps are up there as well. Butterflies, moths are also helpful pollinators, not as much as the others, but beetles as well, to some extent, and hummingbirds too. They sort of get some pollen on them inadvertently when they're feeding. And just to talk a little bit about our bees and wasps, well, I might as well look at some cute bees while I do so. We have over 900 native species of bees in Canada. Now, honeybees are non-native, they're farmed, they're different. That our own native bees, we've got 900 kinds, and they're all so different. You can see from this picture, well, these pictures, I've got one of our bumblebees on the top left on a Culver's root from my garden. Next to it is a yellow-faced or masked bee, so tiny, just a few millimeters long. It was on my screen inside my house. I managed to catch it in a little container and put it outside. But thankfully it stayed put and let me take pictures first. There's a mason bee in the next to that one, and it looks just like a housefly to me. So it's amazing how different our bees look. And if we stop to take a closer look, maybe it's a bee, maybe it's a fly. What does it need? How does it live? Is it going to hurt us? It's a matter of observing more, and we discover so much that way. And there's a bee at the bottom in the middle on my basil flower. I like to leave some of my herbs to go to flower. I harvest a lot, but I leave some to flower, and it helps the pollinators, and then it helps me because then I get to harvest the seeds after, and then I can grow them again next year. You can see a leafcutter bee on the bottom left. It's got pollen on its abdomen. That's where they typically hold their pollen. And on the bottom right is an andrena bee, I believe, with one of our spring woodland flowers, our bellwort. And I want to say that bees and wasps, some of them are social, like the bumblebees and honeybees, which are non-native. And for wasps, we've got the yellow jackets, which can be very aggressive, of course, but also paper wasps, and be careful around them, of course. Although that said, I've been able to play around paper wasps. Their nest has often been in our pine tree, and we're able to play around there, and we've been fine. I don't let them make nests by our door. That's too close. That's dangerous. But generally speaking, if you're peaceful, we can live somewhat harmoniously with them. I've even had them come right close to me and scrape the wood off the banister of my front steps. We're both sitting together side by side peacefully. It's been fine. We always have to be safe. You always have to follow your gut and your common sense and do what you need to do to be safe. But depending on the species, depending on what you're doing, it might actually not be as scary and dangerous as one has previously been led to believe. But that said, always take great care. Now, those are the social ones. A lot of them, most of them, are solitary. So for wasps, for instance, so many species, their stinger has evolved now to simply immobilize prey that they take back to their nest. And most of our are solitary bees do not sting, and the few that do, I believe the stinger is so weak it doesn't really penetrate the skin much. So for the most part, there's again less things to fear around planting for pollinators. And I'll talk a bit about how they make their nests, the solitary bees. They're a little bit different. We'll get into that later, but I just wanted to mention that now because it's kind of a big chunk, and I thought I'd do it while we had pretty pictures to look at. More bee pictures. This one on the left, feeding from bloodroot in the spring. And Heather Home has got some beautiful pictures. She's got some terrific books. If you're ever interested in knowing more about our bees and plants that support them, the native ones, she's a terrific source for that. She is more easterly and a bit of the west. So in terms of western bees, she will have some reference, but not necessarily specializing in that. But she's great to check out. Now, I mentioned that there are some bees and flies and wasps that look a bit similar. So I'm not sure if you have a moment to look to see if you can figure out which one is a bee and which one is not. If you look at perhaps the eyes, look at perhaps, you can't see the antenna so much from here. You look at the legs, if there's something going on there, and you might realize the one on the right is a bee because it has a pollen sac. Bumblebees are the species, or the group of bees rather, that have a special place on the leg to hold pollen in that way. Other bees carry pollen in different ways. On the left is a flower fly. There's this huge group of flies called flower flies, also called hover flies, because some of the little ones will come right in front of your face and they'll hover with curiosity, also called syrphid flies. They can look like bees and wasps. Here, this one is fuzzy and matching the coloring of this bumblebee. But if you look at the eyes on the left, those are flies. They've got large eyes that take up most of their head. The bees takes up less space on the head, and to me, it's more shiny and more oblong. Also, the antennae are different. And in terms of how the pollen is carried, bees do get them all over their bodies as well as flies, but bees tend to have more concentrated areas, like on the abdomen or on the legs, etc. So that said, when you look at this, you might have thought the one on the left was a fly before and the one on the right was a bee. And I've seen pictures of the one on the right on bee websites, but actually the one on the left is a bee, a little teeny tiny bee, and the one on the right is one of our flower flies. So talking about considerations when you're buying plants, and this is applicable when you're talking about food, which we're in now, as well as, shelter, any kind of plant you're buying. It's best if you can avoid plants whose pollen and nectar producing abilities are lost through hybridizing or cultivation. Some cultivars, I think, can be fine, but if it's been overly cultivated and they're sterile, so there's something called like a mop head hydrangea, which has had all the very tiny, inconspicuous little flowers in the center of the flower replaced with all the showier petals that are on the petal-like structures that are around the edge. They've all been replaced to look prettier and showier with the petal-like structures. So there are usually no more fertile flowers there to feed a pollinator. So it's just for show, it's just for us. And if you have a lot of space and you have a lot of beneficial plants, and that's your favorite plant, great, include it. But if you've only got a tiny space and you want to plant something really beneficial, that would not be the choice necessarily. There are other plants that actually are far more beneficial. So plants grown with neonicotinoids are something to avoid. Neonics, for short, are a group of pesticides that are very tenacious. They actually can be sprayed on the seed and they can stay with the plant throughout its entire cycle, impacting the pollinators that then feed on the nectar and the pollen, harming and killing them. And I'm not quite sure in terms of the impacts on birds that then go to the seed. So that's something to be mindful there. The Canadian Wildlife Federation has a line of neonic-free plant kits that go out around Mother's Day. I'm not sure if Home Depots in your area have them. There's a few different kinds, a few different kits. I'm not sure which ones are where. I think it's sporadic as to what they choose. So you might be able to find some left in your local Home Depot. And your local native plant nursery might also have neonic-free plants. I know my local nursery at where I am, they're fantastic. They make sure all the seeds that they bring in for the plants they grow, they read the fine print and they make sure they're neonic free. So I really am happy to endorse that. And if you're not sure how to find that out, ask. And even if the staff don't know, you're raising awareness and you're getting them to think, because I actually have seen and heard from the industry how our consumer interest and our purchasing power is changing. how the industry responds. So it's important. If you're inspired, then ask away and share your thoughts. It's also great to avoid invasive plants. So some plants can spread and people call that invasive, but what I'm talking about are the kinds that are on like actual official provincial lists of invasive plants that are not native and they are spreading into our nature, into our natural spaces, our habitats, our ecosystems, and they're taking over. Like periwinkle can take over our woodlands. We have garlic mustard. It's in bloom right now where I am, and that's taken over a lot of the woodlands. Norway maple, that is a plant, a tree that is commonly planted. Even municipalities have been growing it for a long time, but it's only been in Canada, I'm guessing, for 350 or so years. It's not long enough for our insects to have co-evolved with them and to use them. And you think, oh, that's great. I don't want insects anyway. But most insects, we never notice any damage. Most insects operate under our noses and we're clueless that they're there. Some of them, yes, can cause problems and some of them can bite, but for the most part, they don't do much damage. And we need insects. Our birds need insects. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So Norway maples, yes, if you're going to buy a maple, opt for our native maples. They're so beautiful and they are very beneficial. Again, I mentioned the Toronto ravines earlier. I've heard someone say to me that there are Norway maples that are taking over. They're spreading and they leaf out earlier and longer, and they're suppressing a lot of the native vegetation there. So a lot of our wildlife that have co-evolved with what was there, they can't necessarily stay there. They're being pushed out. So it's sort of it's a domino effect. And some nurseries, I'm told, even sell like cultivars of Norway maple. I think it's called Crimson Red, and some people sometimes think it's like a native red maple, and it's not. So buyer beware there. Just have a look and see what you can find out. Okay, so that's not what not to include, but do include different flower shapes and sizes, because as you saw, our pollinators are all different shapes and sizes, and they've got different lengths of tongues. They've got different times of year that they function. So again, get blooms from early spring to late fall where possible, and include some regionally native plants. Very quickly here, we've got our native hollyhock, verbena, in the middle there at the top, a pasque flower. At the top right, below that is a golden currant, Ribes aureum. Next to that on the left is one of our native lilies. Next to that is one of our native columbines. Canada has some beautiful native columbines. As one person mentioned, theirs is just beginning to bloom. I think that person was in Peterborough. So I guess more native plants they can be, yes, some of them might look weedy, but a lot of them are beautiful. And depending on where you plant them, they can be very striking. And I meant to include here a picture of our native cacti. Hopefully I have it somewhere else. They're gorgeous. They're a large, showy yellow, bright yellow flower with a red center. And yes, Canada has native cacti. We've got 4 species. And it's amazing how remarkable our native plants are. One on the bottom right, I love. It's migratory. And when you walk by it, you'd never know flower with looking like this, because this is using a macro lens and blown up quite significantly. But if you stop to smell the roses and you stop to look a little bit more closely if you can, it's amazing the beautiful patterns you'll find. Okay, so native plants are also a very critical food source for some wildlife. Some wildlife are generalists. They can manage with different, let's say flowers, for instance, and some have to have certain groups of flowers. There are bees that are goldenrod specialists. They have to have goldenrod. And there are some goldenrod that do not spread and take over. There are some goldenrod that are very tame and tidy and pretty. So it is possible to support them if you're worried about something spreading in your garden. Monarchs and milkweed, we know now, I think monarchs have to have milkweed, and were 14 species native to Canada. Now there's only 13 left. One has been extirpated, meaning it's no longer here. It's not extinct from the world, but it's not here anymore because I think habitat loss removed it from the area. In Southern Ontario, the Carner blue butterfly was dependent on lupins, but I believe through habitat loss, the lupins disappeared instead of the butterfly. Although I'm not sure if I heard that there was a reintroduction or someone spotted one. I'm not sure, but at last I heard that's where things stood. And the native plants often have the required nutrients needed by wildlife. I mentioned Doug Tellamy earlier. There's a study in one of his books he talks about where you look at the native species of shrubs and the European or non-native counterpart. And to us, they might look the same, but they had different proportions of fat to sugar. So when you think of our birds that are overwintering and that are migrating, the nutrients they need for that are very refined, and nature is very complex and has it down pat. So we best if we can support our birds and others with our native species where possible. And when you buy locally grown plants, it's usually better for you because they've been grown in that environment. They're more able to withstand the conditions of that environment. Okay, so those are flowers. We're moving on now to leaves, which is a little bit faster now from here on in. So a lot of our butterflies and moths require specific leaves. We have a handout on that. The monarch, as you know, likes milkweeds. In the middle, we've got a black swallowtail, and it would normally go to golden alexanders, which is a native plant, is one out west and one out east. But it's evolved to adapt to parsley and Queen Anne's lace and other plants in that family. And on the far right is a red admiral, and as a caterpillar, it needs stinging nettle. And I know people think, oh, I don't want stinging nettle in my garden. Are you crazy? But hear me out. So these butterflies require it. And I have had properties where I've always had nettles, and in the part of my garden where they were tucked away, and my young daughter running around, she knew so the nettles were not to go in there. There are ways to grow it safely. It doesn't spread fast. It'll just gradually spread as a patch. It's easy to tame back if you need. And I harvest it. It's actually a complete protein. It's got all kinds of nutrients. And so I harvest it, I dry it, and I use it as a tea. So, but if you're going to handle it, you might want to use gloves and be careful. But again, if it's not for you, that's fine. But if it is, if it's intriguing to you, there's all kinds of ways of looking at things differently where we can help wildlife, help ourselves. It's about a balance and finding our own balance of what works for us in our space where we are right now, and finding our own way. Okay, moving on to fruit, of course, lots of great native shrubs and plants, perennials making fruit for all kinds of birds and some mammals. Waxwings, thrushes, robins, tanagers, woodpeckers, bluebirds, orioles, chickadees, and so many more feed on fruit. And let's see, we've got, if I go clockwise from the top left, that's our fragrant sumac. Then we have the golden currant I showed you earlier. And then to the top right is the high-bush cranberry. Below that is our native holly and Ilex verticillata. To the left of that is our false Solomon seal. To the left of that, in the middle at the bottom, is one of our dogwoods. And then to the left of that, in the bottom left, is one of our viburnums. I think that is Viburnum dentatum. So nuts and seeds, of course, some plants form fruit, some form nuts and seeds. It's best if you can leave your perennials to go to seed and leave the seeds, the seed heads, throughout the fall and the winter. You'll get chickadees and finches and juncos come and feed off those seeds, and you can always clean them up in the spring. And nuts, of course, are important. Even to blue jays and some ducks eat nuts, believe it or not, or they ate the acorns rather. So other kinds of food beyond plants are the invertebrates that are attracted to that space, then are then food for others. So, amphibians and birds, other insects. So it's important to have as much of the diversity of the plant types and heights and layers, so we attract all kinds of species to come. And again, insects are so important. Again, I'll mention Doug Tallamy, another study he shared, talked about all the insects required by some birds during a 2-week period when they had their young to feed. And the Carolina chickadee, similar to ours, required between 6,000 and 9,000 insects in a 2-week period. And that's only for when they're in the nest. Once they leave the nest and follow the parents around, they're still hungry, they're still being fed. So where did they come from? Well, our gardens, if they have all this wonderful diversity, then we can support all these different insects, including the juicy caterpillars of different butterflies and moths. And again, nature keeps itself in check. But then we're helping all the birds. And I mentioned the Norway maple earlier. I had a lady come to me at a workshop one time and said, what am I doing wrong? I don't have birds. I've got the native perennials and I've got trees, but the tree was a Norway maple. And because there are not insects going to that tree, because they haven't co-evolved to rely on it, the birds are not going to want to nest there, generally speaking, unless they're desperate, because they're going to have to fly far to get food which uses energy. And it means their young are going to be vulnerable in that time. So they're going to want to nest in the trees that have the insects. And You know, trees like maples and oaks and willows and birches, all our native species, they attract different kinds of insects, which attract different kinds of birds that have learned to feed in different layers. Like some warblers will feed on the outer layer of the tree, some close to the trunk, some high up, some low down, some are brown, feeding and nesting birds. So again, if we can mix it up in our garden, we're going to see all kinds of wonderful creatures. And tree sap is important for some. We have yellow-bellied sapsucker that will go and make holes. And then sometimes the hummingbirds and butterflies will follow and drink the sap after as well. Buds can be useful. I remember shoveling in the wintertime once and seeing in my apple trees grouse feeding, and I realized they must have been feeding on the buds. And there were still lots of blooms and flowers in the spring, but that was what they were needing to eat at the time. Damp ground provides minerals, in particular the salts, for certain butterflies that do what's called mud puddling. So our swallowtails do that. You can see also in the top, one of the smaller pictures on the left, this one here, it was in our parking lot at work. There was a crack filled with a bit of earth. It was a bit damp. Lo and behold, there was a butterfly. And I learned a new species of butterfly that day. It's a question mark. You can recreate this yourself by having open areas of earth, manure, compost, sand that's not sterilized. And when it's damp, butterflies come. And if you don't want to do that for large garden beds, you can just do it for a corner of a garden bed, or you can recreate it with a dish. We have some fun with a child in your life, perhaps draw patterns every time it rains, took the excess water out, and then you can draw another pattern. There are stones in there also for moisture, for insects that want to just go get the water. And if you do want to supplement with bird feeders, that's great. But again, we say that has to be supplemental because the birds have to have natural habitat to thrive. They can't survive on a bird feeder alone. So if you have suet feeders, I highly recommend you buy packs that don't have preservatives. Buy it, put it in your freezer when it's ready to come out in the winter. Then you hang it. Keep the seed feeders clean. Sugar water feeders, you mustn't use dyes or alternative sweeteners like honey, and clean them often, but still have the flowers. So many of the flowers I showed you will support hummingbirds. And experiment and observe. I even found a hummingbird in our demonstration garden around our headquarters, and it was going to teeny little flowers on one of our verbena species. And I looked up online, I looked in all my books, I couldn't find that listed anywhere as a hummingbird plant. And yet there it was in front of my eyes feeding from it. So you never know what you're going to find and what you're going to discover. And yeah, just keep trying things, keep seeing what you can do. And fruit is another thing. Like there's an oriole there feeding from half an orange. Some butterflies will come to that too. I've never done it myself, but I've heard people do it, and they enjoy doing that. So we've done food. That's the biggest chunk. Water is very quick and easy. It can be a simple bowl, be a fancy dish. The main thing is to keep it clean, especially in the summer when it gets hotter and hotter, because bacteria can grow, mosquitoes can breed. Just keep changing the water, give it a quick wipe, give it a scrub if it needs. I just basically just scrub it. I don't use anything harsh. If you really have to clean it, you can use a little bit of natural, gentle, environmentally friendly dish soap, bit of vinegar, but rinse it really well afterwards. And I highly recommend avoiding bird bath heaters in extreme cold. I said this at one point, and apparently it stirred a bit of controversy. People were saying, oh, birds know better. But I have two researchers, bird researchers, that back me up on this. Where you live, if it does get so cold that a bird bath water would freeze, then in nature it is frozen. The birds have evolved for that environment. The only thing open would be perhaps an open river, and they wouldn't go there to bathe or drink. So they don't need it because they're not used to it. They're not expecting it. And some birds actually will go in there. They don't have the instinct to know better, to know that it might be dangerous. And I know one bird researcher who saw a bird go in a heated bird bath, and he was convinced that it was freezing within moments of leaving, and it couldn't free itself fast enough, and he figured that bird was going to die. And I mentioned that to another bird researcher, and he said absolutely. He had some birds at his center, and back then they had left some water out, and it was cold in Montreal. They came back the next morning and they were all dying of hypothermia. They managed to save them, but I would highly avoid where it gets that cold. They don't need the bird bath at that point in time. If it's going to freeze anywhere else, I wouldn't use it. So sorry, a lot of words, but hope that is helpful and thorough enough so you understand the logic behind my point there. Water, of course, ponds have sloping sides, so if animals do go to the edge and they fall in by accident, they can climb out on a log or stones. Recirculating streams are great if you're able to have one. I know when we had our natural pond put in at work, these are pictures from our work underside. The moment the stream gets turned on, oh my gosh, the birds come right away. And you'll see there's some mature trees in the background. They'll be in the mature trees. They'll go to the small shrub near the pond, the stream. Then they'll go in. Then they'll go back to the little shrub. Then they'll go back to the mature trees, always checking if it's safe to move to the next step. So it's kind of neat to have the habitat all together. It's amazing what you'll attract. So food, water, now shelter. So shelter, like us, we get cover from the elements, but unlike us, they get protection from predators and nesting and resting spots and perches to spy their next meal. So shelter comes in all kinds of forms, again, mainly plants, trees and shrubs, all different kinds, evergreen and deciduous, like those that lose their leaves. I know some robins will go initially, their first clutch of eggs will be in an evergreen, where it's more protected, and then in a deciduous tree for their second clutch if they have one, because there's more airflow when it's warmer. Vines are very useful as well. It adds more layers to otherwise barren spot on a fence, and sometimes insects will use it, sometimes birds, little tiny birds will use it. Dense patches of vegetation are great for ground nesting birds, as well as what you see on the top left. It's a little toad that I managed to see in the moss under the little plants. And snags, so dead or dying trees, just see how I'm doing for time here. Okay, dead or dying trees called snags. I totally am all for safety. If it is a danger to you or anyone in your area, obviously do what you have to do, remove it. If you do, leave as much of the stump as you're willing to, as much as you feel is safe to. Perhaps you can have plants growing around it to make it look more visually pleasing to you, but it will still continue to support the insects that will be there, and therefore it supports birds like woodpeckers and whatnot that will go and feed there, and other kinds of birds, sometimes warblers and other creatures. But if you can leave it standing and just simply perhaps remove the branches that are dangerous, or where we are, because the water flow changed with all the development around where we are at work, the mature old trees were dying, so we had the very tops lopped off. We were fortunate we were able to do that, and so the snags were able to stand for many, many, many more years. Most of them are still there. And we have all kinds of birds come, flickers, and we even have a pileated woodpecker come, and they need not just snags, they need like a decent size width snags, because the bigger the bird, the bigger the hole for their nest. And I remember learning years ago, they don't just need it for their own nesting purposes in the spring, but they'll also use it throughout the year as a roosting spot from predators, from elements. And one study showed that the woodpecker needed multiple roosting spots. It moved around. So it's really important, if we want to help our forests not be devastated by insect infestations, to have our woodpeckers around. And even beyond woodpeckers, all kinds of birds will nest in cavities in these trees. So for instance, I heard the number, I think it's 85 species in North America, birds, all kinds of woodpeckers, but even like wood ducks, even small owls, like screech owls, all kinds of birds will go. And some of them are primary cavity nesters. They're the ones that create the hole in the first place. Some are secondary cavity nesters, like our nuthatches and chickadees, which will use existing holes. So you're helping all kinds of creatures, if it's safe. Again, for you to find your own balance, but people often think, oh, it's dead, done. Nature has a purpose for everything, and we're cleaning up so much that it really is imbalancing things on the planet. Speaking of which, it's fun seeing the birds fly around making their nests. They've got the dry grasses in their beak. But where do they get them from? If our gardens are so tidy, we no longer have dry grasses for them, and they're resorting to like strings of plastic I've seen. So if we can leave, again, clean up in the garden till the spring, and wherever you see, like, if you've got like ornamental grasses or long bits and things that they could use, perhaps you could leave them be. Perhaps you really want to clean up an area, perhaps do that, and then maybe leave a pile somewhere where you think the birds might notice it. Just little things just to keep in mind that might be helpful. Different plant parts, creatures like hummingbirds, they'll use things like lichen and spider's web, even moss, ferns, mud for some of our birds, like the robins and whatnot. A shelter comes in many forms. So rotting logs can be useful for all kinds of creatures. to feed from and to find shelter in, including some of our teeny tiny solitary bees. When you slow down, it's amazing what you're going to notice. Some, maybe years and years ago, I might have thought, oh my gosh, those are flies, if I even had noticed them. But now I realize those are solitary bees, and they're making their home in that log in the woods on the trail when I walk on the trail. Leaf litter is really great if you can leave your leaves be. And I know it's an issue with a lot of us where we live. We do need to be tidy to some extent. But if you can rake your leaves perhaps under to the edge of the canopy, anything you can do to support, that'll help your tree, the roots, get them, the leaves will break down and help support the roots. It gives them protection from the harsh sun, protecting the roots temperature-wise. But also it's a natural layer that a lot of our butterfly moth species, they will drop from the tree to finish their metamorphosis in the leaf litter below the tree. Like you see on the bottom left there, hummingbird clearwing moth. They need that, so as do many others. And so if you can leave the leaves, and even if you have to remove the leaves then in the spring, if you could leave them perhaps until I think the understanding is around 10 degrees day and night, and then move them, then they will have had a chance to finish their cycle and then fly off. I look at leaves differently. I've always been very mindful of keeping and using them, but I'm very mindful of like if I'm moving leaves, like I'm kind of checking. Now you can't drive yourself crazy with this. You do have to have some kind of balance, but it's just more things to think about. And I mentioned I'd tell you a little bit about the shelter, the nests for some of our solitary bees and wasps. The top right is an Isodontia wasp, I'm told by experts. I wouldn't know myself. And this one, it's created a nest like you see on the bottom right, where they lay an egg, they leave it some food, seal it off, and they have several chambers, and then they seal it off completely, as you can see on the picture in the bottom middle. Well, the Isodontia wasp is kind of neat, telltale, because they all seal the nests off differently. Some use like chewed up grass with a bit of mud, some use different things. This wasp uses dried grass, and it's like been described similar to like a witch's broom or a broom. So that's like a nickname for that wasp. Anyway, plant stems are really important. So you see in the middle at the top, there's a little bee sticking its head in a plant stem. And that's another thing that's really being talked about nowadays, that a lot of our solitary bees nest in the ground, but a lot of them also will go in cavities, some of which are plant stems. So this really confused me, because this is a relatively recent thing that's been talked about that I'm learning and understanding. So, but I think I have it down pat. So I'm glad I can tell you with a bit of clarity. In this fall, you can leave things be. In the spring, when you're cleaning up, if you have plant stems, you can trim them to like 1.5 or 2 feet if you're comfortable. And soon enough, the new growth will cover that up. But what you're doing is you're leaving it so the bees, as they're searching for nest sites, if it's hollow, they've got a spot. And if it's pithy inside, if it's soft enough for them to chew, they'll chew it, as this bee is doing here. And I'm very excited to show you that I found it in my own garden a couple of days ago. One on the left is a little bee that was trying to make a hole in a stick. I keep sticks for like staking tomatoes and different things that come in handy. This is a really hard stick, and I was amused it managed to get as much done as it did. You can see its head's kind of in there. It already made a little bit of a hole, but it gave up. But then I looked in my patch of Monarda, where I'd left some Monarda stems, and there's some brown-eyed Susans in there too. There's holes, like I don't know if you can see, but they were all solid when I snipped them. And then I look at all of them, they all have a perfect little hole in them. And I'm like, whoa, little baby bees are in there. I'll have to keep an eye on that. It's kind of fun when you get to see it yourself after hearing about it. But the more you discover and the more you look and observe, it's amazing what you'll find. So together, the food, water, and shelter create spaces, kind of like rooms and furniture in our own homes. It creates spaces for a bunch of us to do our own thing in a small space, but we have that ability, habitat. So that's food, water, and shelter. Now, earth-friendly gardening practices, it won't take long to go through that. Avoiding pesticides is the key one, and then different other things you can do working with nature. So you can avoid pesticides by working with nature. So growing a diversity of plants to attract a diversity of creatures, such as different amphibians and snakes and birds and whatnot, that will then predate on on potential pests. And I mentioned how, actually, I forgot to tell you, when we were doing the 7 kinds of pollinators, I mentioned beetles. That beetle actually was kind of a firefly. I was delighted to find it in my garden. I realized fireflies like moisture. They like sort of dense, like tall grasses and dense kind of vegetation like that. And it was on one of my ornamental grasses. And I managed to get a picture. We were still learning so much about fireflies, but apparently a lot of the species, when they're young, in their younger stage, before they're an adult, they predate on a lot of our potential pest species. So again, all diversity of plants, you can support all these different creatures that are helping keep things in check without us even realizing. Strengthen the plants you do have with compost. Help them be strong, because it has been shown that the weaker ones are what tend to attract problems, and the strong ones are more typically, for certain things, able to ward off or deter potential pest problems. Of course, match your plants in the right condition. You want your plant to be strong and healthy. So if it likes sun, if you want to experiment and put it in shade because that's all you got and you love the plant, well, of course, go for it. But it's going to thrive in the conditions that it's known to have, that it's evolved to have. So the stronger the plant is usually the one that's growing in the conditions it needs. And of course, we mentioned having the diversity of plants. You're helping attract all the different helpers, and using gentle ways to repel. If you do have to do something, try something with just picking it off yourself, or maybe just a spray with your hose. If you do have to resort to a garlic spray, then again, you're spot applying where you're doing it. We don't encourage cayenne. I mean, that maybe 25 years ago we mentioned it, but we really found that can be problematic because the squirrels and what can get it on their paws. They can rub their eyes and really aggravate their eyes. So we don't encourage that. But I mean, there's all kinds of different other methods you can use to repel them gently, pests gently rather. Composting is a great way to take your kitchen scraps and turn it into what's called gardening gold, gardener's gold. It improves the soil, whether you've got sandy soil or clay soil. Mixing in compost can help either bind and hold water more, or else loosen things up so the water drains better. And by not putting our kitchen scraps in the garbage, we're saving our wild spaces. Because I used to work in an office where waste diversion office, they had to site a new landfill, cost millions of dollars, and no one wants a landfill in their backyard. So a lot of the stuff going to landfill was at the time, and I'm not quite sure what the stat is, this year, but it's kitchen waste. Doesn't need to go there. And when it does go there, the moisture and the organics and interact with other things, and it creates what's called leachate, which is a toxic thing that has to be caught and processed. That takes all more money, more tax dollars. So if you can compost at home, and if you can't, maybe you're on a city program. If you can't, maybe you have a neighbor you can share with. I did a blog recently on a cool system called Share Waste, where you can find a neighbor near you in your community that perhaps needs or can take your compost. All different systems out there to play with. And compost is such a great thing. Conserving water, of course, is really important too. You can help yourself with rain barrels. These are 2 different gardens I've been with over the years. Actually, my parents' gardens from years ago, and always had a rain barrel, so handy. One thing I learned with the rain barrels is, though, one year we had a terrible drought. Like, it was like drying up rivers. And when the rain came, I'd get everything out from like in bucket to my daughter's wading pool to try to catch whatever rain we could. When we did have rain, I found what washed from the roof into the rain barrel was very like oily. Like it just didn't look good. Like whatever chemical was on the tile of the roof in the heat and the lack of rain really concentrated there. So just generally speaking, it's usually fine. Maybe you want to use it mainly for non-edible plants, depending on the kind of roof you have and the kind of rainfall you get, the frequency and the heat. So just keep an eye on that. But generally they're great. When it might want to put a cover on it so little animals don't go in and drown. Water plants in the morning to avoid evaporation in the hot sun. It's amazing how many sprinklers I see going at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when at the hot sun. And maybe that day, that's the only day they could do it. But you're evaporating a lot of water. So if you're on a well, etc., you want to be careful. Watering at the base of plants, again, conserves water, goes straight to the roots. It's even better rather than going on the leaves, and perhaps then the sun comes out and can scorch the leaves. Or if you do it in the evening, you could get perhaps mildewy kind of problems. So watering at the base of plants in the morning is typically a good idea. And native and drought tolerant plant species. So mulching is another thing we can use. And how are we doing for time? Okay, I need to wrap up soon. Mulching is great. It conserves moisture, it keeps weeds down, it returns nutrients to the soil, it can minimize erosion and helps keep the soil temperature even. I recommend undyed, non-dyed mulch if you're going to buy it. There's lots of other things you can use, leaves, straw, grass clippings, and even little pebbles if you wanted. But then you can leave some spots bare if you want to have some of the mud puddler butterflies. Lawns, you know, so many times we just don't even water a lawn, and it's perfectly fine at work. We do that. We never water the lawn. And yes, if it's really hot in the summer, at certain points it does go dormant, but then it comes back. So it's again a matter of finding the balance. If you can minimize the lawn you have, to create as much habitat as possible, and then with the lawn you do have, if you do water it, you may just want to water it very deeply occasionally, when, you know, depending on the rainfall. That way the roots do go deeper, and the deeper the root, the healthier the plant generally is. And speaking of sort of safety and wellness, people often put things on their windows to stop birds from flying into them, and nothing really has been that successful until these little white dots came along. And there are some other systems now that are actually doing well too. The idea is to have them close enough together that even a little tiny chickadee feels it can't navigate flying in between. And I know people who said it's like night and day. And even us at work, we have that as well. And the picture on the bottom right is you can also use like an oily chalk if you want to have fun with your kids, or if the kid in you wants to have fun. So try that out too. So in general, keep in mind proportions. The more space you have, the more opportunity you have to create habitat to support these wild neighbors that are so important to us. Keep it enjoyable, have fun, keep it manageable. Just do what you can this year and do what you can next year. And then remember, this kind of gardening is so versatile, and you can adapt it to any style of gardening, any budget, any property size, or lifestyle need. It's up to you to find whichever way suits you, but there's lots you can do in the meantime. So Get Garden Habitat Certification is a program we have that if you are applying these principles to whatever degree, food, water, shelter, and avoiding pesticides, you can apply for certification where you would be certified as wildlife-friendly habitat. And you can see here all different garden sizes and styles, and the one in the top in the middle is highly landscaped, and they've got all the features. They're a great garden, but people say, oh my gosh, I can't afford to do that. That's like beyond me. So the one below it is just a very simple corner garden, and they've got different layers, different species. And again, we can help wildlife in all different ways that suit us. Some more pictures here, again, some fancy gardens and some less formal ones, tiny patch by the sidewalk. And keep in mind the needs year round. So even in winter, you know, we're doing some good for the overwintering wildlife. And then when you're certified, you can get a sign. We have a $50 one, which is the brushed metal, and a less expensive one. I think it's $20 now, the colorful one. And then you can get a pin on a map to show how we're all collectively coming together helping. We also have a Wild Generations Club where seniors and youth can come together to do gardening. When I send the email with a follow-up email to this through Zoom with a replay link, I'll include these links too. So if any of you are interested in participating, you can. Wild Spaces is a program for schools for certain grades where they can learn about pollinators and then plant for pollinators. Sometimes they can apply to get free plants too from our plant kits. We've got all kinds of resources. We've got different handouts. We have a 20-page color guide that talks about what we're talking about here. Posters, all kinds of posters, more than what I'm even showing here, that you're welcome to order if you've got an event perhaps, or if you want to put it up in your school, etc. We have an online course which is self-directed that you're welcome to participate with. We have webinars like this. So again, keep checking our webinars. A whole bunch of different departments and programs at the Canadian Wildlife Federation have webinars, and sometimes they do sort of crossover and support each other. So just check them out. And again, I'll have a link for that if you're not sure where to find them. We have on our Gardening for Wildlife website supplier list, encyclopedia, a newsletter, articles, etc. We have a demonstration garden you're welcome to visit if you're in the area. And we have a Facebook group you can join, and a bunch of other social media kind of things that you can check out. I'm going fast because you are going to get the replay. You can watch this at your leisure later on. We have an iNaturalist project. And iNaturalist is something where you can take a picture, you can post it on this website. Millions are doing this across the country now, and you can get help identifying the picture. You can help scientists, and scientists have been known to say, oh my gosh, that picture, that's never been here before. It's an invasive species. And then they formulate an action plan around it, or they discover a creature that they haven't seen in however many decades, and it's cool, it's back. So you never know how you're helping science. You can learn about nature, and it's a fun way to interact with other people that are like-minded. So this is an idea of some of the great information that's on there. And some of the projects, there's all kinds of projects happening all across the country, and maybe you might want to start one too. So this just gives you an idea. You might have the maple trees of Toronto. There's, look at the ticks in the Maritimes, giants of Nova Scotia. There's all kinds of projects that one can participate in. That's kind of a fun way to connect. And of course, joining your local field naturalist club. There's iNaturalist, eBird, visiting nature trails, slowing down, reading the signs there, asking the people that run those places, all kinds of ways to learn about your local and migratory wildlife and the native plants that support them. So hopefully you can get out and notice and enjoy. And I want to thank you very much for being here. I'm going to go through the questions now, and hopefully I can get to them all before we finish. Oh, okay, Leanne's asking about deer. I seem to have had great success using marigolds as a deterrent to these lovely neighbors. Am I onto something? I do also try to plant deer-resistant flowers and crops in our unfenced gardens. Yeah, deer. With any kind of deer, rabbit, groundhog type of thing, there are some things that work generally well, but there's always exceptions, and so it's always such a gray area. There's never, I wish I could give people like an absolute, but yes, there are definitely some plants that will deter deer, and depending on how desperate your deer are, they may or may not pay attention. I'm so glad to hear you have success using marigolds. That's really great. Some people use smelly things like garlic and chives, or other herbs that can be very useful for deer and for other animals like rabbits and such. So thanks for sharing for that. And yeah, there are definitely deer-resistant flowers. We have a list on our website as well. And thank you for sharing. Is it possible to help an anthill move safely in our backyard, or taking over the entrance to our shed? Oh, yes, I've had challenges with deer and ants and everything. I don't know. I know where I have had ants where I didn't want them. I mean, rain does come. They are aware that they are used to water, so I feel it's not terribly cruel, but I have, watered there more. And if I watered there more, I figured they're gonna realize it's not a good place to be, and it'll deter them. I don't know how that would work in terms of your situation. And yeah, I wish you well with that. And maybe even, for next year also, if that's a spot that seemed to be a likely spot next year, you can make it extra moist in that area to deter them. I'm told that things like peppermint and whatnot can also deter ants. I think it depends on how you use it. Maybe you could take some dried peppermint leaves, crush it into a powder, and sprinkle it into the holes, and they'll not want that, and then they'll move themselves. Maybe someone else here has an idea to share, but I'm sorry, I don't have any more ideas than that, but hopefully that's useful. What do lacings love? Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. I'm not really sure, because that's one that I'd have to look up myself. We do have a resource we created years ago, Good Bugs, Bad Bugs, although I want to redo it, because to me, all bugs have a role, so I want to take away the good and the bad. And lacings are mentioned on there. I don't remember, though, what they love, but I will make a note to include that handout as a link in the replay, in the email that follows out. Okay, can you repeat best plants for hummingbirds? Well, I'm going to send you the link for the hummingbird plants, because anything that has a slight tubular shape, and it can be large, like a columbine, or it can be super tiny, like a verbena, they will go to. Even zinnias, they're not native. They're beneficial though, because they still have pollen and nectar, especially if you get the old-fashioned kind that aren't, full of petals. They still have lots of flowers that are easily accessible. I have hummingbirds come to my zinnias that I grow every year from seed. And so, but for native ones, I will send a list as well in the email. I've checked out native plant kits in Edmonton, the ones offered at those stores. Oh yes, not even to our area. Any plants to offer different. Okay, so those plant kits, gone through a cycle for lots of time, lots of years. Ever since they were created, the idea was to be neonic free. That was the premise. And I've only been involved and pulled in here and there, and now I'm more fully involved, which is great. So our growers do have a list to draw from for the different areas that are native plants that are perhaps more garden worthy, or people might be interested in having them, that they are possibly grow. There are issues, unfortunately. The issues are because native plants are still growing in popularity, getting seed of true type natives is a huge issue. So that is a big stumbling block, which we are working. I've got colleagues working in other areas that are for other projects as well, are working to try to get over that block and try to create these sort of seed orchards, seed farms for the growers to make more of them available. Also, in terms of where they're sold, we are trying to have them all native. And we are trying to say, okay, out here are the native ones to your area. For the most part, we can't be specific to every single city. We have to go by the general region. But that said, one of our growers, the west one, their reach is so far. And so it is something we are really trying to narrow down to make sure at least it's native to the province, even if it can't be to that specific area. But we're doing our very, very best. There are going to be some limitations. So the premise is they are neonic free, they are beneficial, they are native generally to that general area of Canada, but not necessarily to that region. So I'm sorry if there are challenges, but we have a native plant supplier list. And so I will include that list as well. And perhaps there is a nursery near you that is growing very specific plants to your area. So I will put that in as well. So thanks, Nadine, for that question. And Christy asking, sorry, clearing moth, not lacewing. Oh, okay. What do clearing moths love? Okay. Clearing moths, as adults, they will go to a variety of flowers, but they will often go to the tubular ones. And again, they're actually similar to hummingbirds. They call them clearing, like hummingbird clearing moths, because they behave like hummingbirds. They hover in front of the flower when they feed rather than landing on it. So like a hummingbird, they want those tubular flowers. So they will go to lilacs. They'll go to the native wild bergamot and bee balm. That's one of the pictures I had in there. And I've seen them go to, I think, dogbane. So a variety of different tubular flowers they will go to, and they're quick. They come, they go, they're gone. So if you get to see one, it's awesome. But if you have any kind of tubular flower, especially our native ones, then they have a good chance that you're supporting them if they're in your area. Thoughts on earthworms? They're non-native. What do we do? Oh yes, should we keep them? Well, I'm not removing earthworms from my garden. I acknowledge they are not native, and I'm just mindful of our forests. We don't want to be moving earth from our garden and logs from our garden into a woodland area, because you don't know what you're bringing to that area, and if they're not meant to be there, then they totally impact that ecosystem. There's a new kind of worm that I've heard that's come in that's very problematic. But you're not talking about that, and that's relatively new, and I'm not sure what to say about that. But generally speaking, earthworms, I'm just mindful not to move them around. That's my main thing. If they're in the garden, they are aerating the soil, they are food for the robins, so I just make peace with it where it's at. I'm not actually doing anything. I don't think they harm anything specifically. It's just in our natural woodlands and such, they do change the balance in terms of the organic waste that they're eating and how quickly they eat it. And so it's more intricate than I'm aware, but I hope that's helpful to you. Does clover land cover help wildlife? Clover, I think you mean clover like in the grass perhaps. And yeah, sure. If you have clover in your lawn, what lawn I have, I've got clover in my lawn, and I do see the bees go to it. I have my mower high enough that I try not to cut it. So the lawn is still low. I don't have my lawn crazy wild high. I do have it low, but this low growing clover you can have. And when they're in bloom, I kind of cut around them, or I leave that patch be for a while. So everyone has to find their own balance, of course. There are some lawns you can get that you never have to mow, and they've got all kinds of neat native mixes in them. There's all different options one can play with there, but I think I'm digressing. So Leanne's asking, I realize my dear question sounds like I don't welcome them. Oh, no, not at all. Just on your tomatoes and cucumbers. I get it. And honestly, I've tried so many things. Like had the fencing and really high fencing, and that wasn't high enough. So I would then tie string from the post to try to stop them going in, because I'm fine sharing stuff, but some stuff, you really want to harvest yourself as well. So I totally get that. And I didn't take it that way. Thank you. I thought native wild columbine was not attracted to rabbits. I don't know who is eating the flowers. Oh, I'm glad you're liking the presentation. Thank you. Yeah, who's eating the flowers? Again, even if there are lists and books and online about generally what animals may not eat, if they're desperate, I think they still eat them. I think I've seen exceptions myself to that rule. So they're kind of like a generality. What could be eating your columbine? I'm not sure. Maybe even a groundhog. Maybe you've got a groundhog in your area. What did I have one time? Was it a squirrel or a chipmunk? It was just taking something and then nibbling and leaving it, and it was just wasting. After a while, it stopped. So honestly, I'm not quite sure. You almost need to watch out and figure out what's doing that, because those little critters, they get up to all kinds of things. How do I keep wasps from coming to my hummingbird feeder and birdhouse? That's tricky. I'm not sure, because again, the sweet liquid of the hummingbird feeder at some times of year, like later in the summer, I think especially, is when they'll go, because they're even more starved of the flower nectar, and so they're desperate to get the sweet somehow. Maybe it's a balance of having more flower nectar nearby. I'm really not sure about that one, and maybe there are tips if you Google it, but I just don't know offhand myself. And the birdhouse, well, yeah, the birdhouse, I mean, if you are cleaning it yearly, different creatures will try to set up home in birdhouses. I do know that. I mean, mice can try, the non-native house sparrow might try, starlings, different creatures. I'm not sure about that one. I'm sorry. If I do come across anything between now and sending out that email, I will make a note to include it. So there we are. And I put an idea for moving ants in the chat. Oh, okay, great. So I'll have a look at that, and then perhaps I can include that tip in the replay. And if anyone wants to be checking the chat who had that question, if you're still on, then you can check the chat right now and have a look. But if there are no more questions, I just want to thank you all for being here. And I loved your comments that I saw earlier. It's always fun seeing people participate and share. And thank you for your questions. And I wish you all the very best with your gardening experiences and your gardening situations. And please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions afterwards. I'm not sure when the email is going to go out. I need some time to get the links, and so I'll probably set Zoom to send it out maybe Monday or Tuesday, but it will come for sure. So watch out for that. And I wish you all a great day, and a great gardening season, and hopefully we'll be in touch at some point. Take care. Bye-bye.